welcome everybody to one of the highlights of our annual calendar. It's our World Rhino Day event, in which we get everybody together to celebrate rhinos and share some of the latest rhino news and updates. So, of course, World Rhino Day itself happens on the 22nd of September every year. And in 2025, that's a Monday, which isn't the best evening for an event. In London Bridge this evening, and we're joined, I think, by about 170 people online around the world. And this evening, we're going to be talking specifically about rhino numbers and trends and trying to understand what's working for rhinos and what are still some of the challenges. So as many of you will know, every 3 years, the IUCN Rhino Specialist Groups and Traffic put together a very comprehensive rhino status report for the CITES Conference of the Parties. And on this occasion, it'll be happening in Samarkand in late November, early December. And so the Rhino Status Report was published last month, and we're very honored and excited to have 3 of the authors joining us this evening to talk about their findings and share their news. So we will have presentations from each of them, giving us an update on African rhinos, on Asian rhinos, and on the state of illegal rhino horn trade. And then we'll have a chance for a bit of a panel discussion and take some of the questions that have been submitted in advance and will be submitted by the floor and online. So thank you very much for sharing some of your valuable time with us this evening. And thank you also to our experts. So let me just give you a quick introduction to them. Firstly, Dr. Sam Ferreira is dialing in from South Africa. Sam is the Scientific Officer of the African Rhino Specialist Group. He also works for South African National Parks as their large mammal ecologist. And Sam's published scientific output around rhinos is huge and incredibly diverse. It spans a whole range of disciplines, from trends in the role of poaching for rhino horn in disrupting rhino dynamics, as well as looking at how rhino population performance is influenced by density dependence mechanisms. He's worked on various kinds of rhino biology and the influence of a whole range of environmental and density effects on population vital rates. Sam's also published some really interesting work on anti-poaching approaches, crime network disruption and responses, as well as communication framings for rhinos. And I know from the questions submitted in advance that some of these anti-poaching approaches are of great interest to our audience this evening. Secondly, we're joined by Dr. Bibhab Kumar Talukdar, who's dialing in from India this evening. Bibhab is the Secretary General and CEO of Aranyak, and he's also the chair of the IUCN SSC Asian Rhino Specialist Group. Bibhab's a member of the Rhino Taxon Advisory Group for the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. He's a member of the National Board of Wildlife, including the Project Elephant Steering Committee of the Indian government, and a member of the Rhino Task Force of Assam. And last but not least, live here in the office this evening is Sharon Baruch-Mordo. And we're very grateful for her traveling down from Cambridge to be here with us in person this evening. So Sharon is a senior specialist on elephant and rhino trade for Traffic in Cambridge in the UK. And she manages and analyzes global data sets of illegal trade to infer trends and inform international policy as part of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Sharon received her PhD in ecology at Colorado State University and has since applied her quantitative and spatial analysis skills to inform decision-making on various conservation issues from local to global scales, including human-wildlife conflict, land use change, as well as illegal wildlife trade. So let's get this evening's proceedings underway, and we'll start with Sam, who is going to give us an update on the situation with rhinos in Africa. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good evening, everybody from around the world, and those that have got some nice glasses of wine in their hands. It is indeed a privilege to chat to you and share with you at least some of the insights and also some of the best practices and good things that are happening. But of course, there's always opportunities for improving, you know. Can we go can we start it? Thank you. So let's first quickly look at what the status of rhinos is. And this graph that you see here reflects the changes since we sort of got a handle of rhino numbers better than we were before from about the 1970s. And obviously, the white rhinos, so in this case, we've got southern white rhinos and northern white rhinos. Northern white rhinos are those little dark brown bit. And certainly the white rhinos have increased quite well till about 2010s, 2011s, when the poaching skirts that started in 2007 really started having an impact. And I think importantly, the previous by the previous COP, which was 3 years ago, the population has declined to roughly about the same what it is now. There's about 15,700 rhinos right now. Um, but importantly, I think what really important is that there were quite good gains for a couple of years, and then in the last year there were some new challenges, and we will reflect on that a little bit. But in essence, the number of rhinos in 2020 fall by the end of 2024 was more or less the same as what it was in 2022, even though there was a bit of an increase in between those years. Um, when we look at black rhinos, of course, the historic data is a very different pattern with a massive decline right up to the mid 1990s. But importantly, in the three extant species since then, there has been a consistent increase, and this increase is actually quite good. It doesn't look that good on the graph because, of course, I start with the high numbers. And certainly by the end of 2024, we had about 6,700, just over 6,000, or under 6,800 black rhinos in Africa. Uh, Black rhinos are still critically endangered, while white rhinos are, of course, a little bit better classified as near threatened. Um, but of course, the primary challenge one have to ask is why do we see these sort of patterns, particularly those decline patterns? And although there are lots of different threats to rhinos, global environmental change drivers, like, for example, habitat alteration or destruction, climate change, etc., the real big problem is really the unsustainable harvesting, particularly illegal harvesting of rhinos. And that particular graphic that you see there of African rhinos being poached, and this is sort of recorded since the recent poaching's onslaught started in 2007. And by the 2015s, we had fairly high numbers, and you just look at that, that's 1,300 rhinos a year killed. That was substantially reduced over a period up to 2020, which of course the year of COVID. And then since then, we've been more or less hanging around about 600, between 500 and 600 rhinos being poached each year. Largely still, I think 90% of these are taking place in South Africa still. But what was interesting is we wanted to know, numbers of rhinos. There's certainly when people see there's a reduction in the number of rhinos poached, often they reflect that as just a decrease in the number of rhinos that is still alive. That's why that bottom left graphic illustrates actually the poaching rate. So this is actually the number of rhinos poached in a year as a fraction of or percentage of the rhinos that were actually alive in the beginning of that year. And we see that pattern that indeed that reduction in poaching was genuine, and that the low poaching rates that we have hovered between 2 and 2.5% over the last 4 or 5 years, since 2020. But what was more important for us is we wanted to know because it's unlikely that one will get poaching completely to zero. So what sort of threshold is important? And we plotted the population growth rate on the y-axis against the poaching rate. And importantly, when you have poaching rates where it's roughly below 3.5%, you are likely to get an increase in your populations over time. So that's a very important threshold to target or to think for when you are managing. There are, of course, outliers and things like that, so there is some variance around that particular estimate, but I think it's an important concept which certainly is helping guiding the continental approaches right across Africa. Um, So with that sort of brief reflection, there are some things that are working well, and one of the really important things that happened is dehorning, particularly in South Africa, where while we are doing quite a lot of very good anti-poaching and protection initiatives, we also the rangers by dehorning rhinos also changed the reward, and that has certainly have been a very good short-term tactic to increase safety. In addition to that, there are opportunities for rewilding rhinos, particularly rhinos that were produced in captive or semi-wild facilities. And a good example is the John Hume rhinos, which is now or platinum rhinos, which is now owned by African Parks. So there are large opportunities with over 2,000 rhinos, white rhinos particularly available, to think how we can rewild them and put them back in the wild to do their thing as a rhino, and it's not just producing other rhinos, but also actually influencing the ecological systems. One of our additional opportunities is that we started to understand the genetic structures of rhinos, of black rhinos in particular, right across the continent, and that is certainly helping the teams to decide. But in the end of the day, it's really about people, personnel, and how we work together. So a lot of these good outcomes are particularly directed to really dedicated rangers, good teamwork, and leadership and how we collaborate, particularly including cross-border cooperation, especially when it is dealing with, for example, dealing with criminal elements. And certainly in the last 3 years, and probably even before that, there has been a substantial more active community involvement in making decisions or even in helping and assisting with rhino conservation. But of course, oops, sorry, just go back. Go on back. There we go. But of course, these successes, as you saw, that we had good growth for a couple of years since the last COP, and then between 23 and 24, there were some challenges. Part of this did link to extended droughts, particularly in places like northwestern Namibia. But there's also been examples where policy shifted. For example, in a country like Eswatini, the policy shifted to wishing to make use of local expertise only, obviously to help advance their own country's abilities, but that did place some constraints in how it could respond to short-term responses that rhinos needed. A key aspect is that there are many rhino populations across the continent, but they in relatively small areas and they're relatively isolated from each other. So these isolated populations and fragmented habitats really require us to think much more smarter about how do we integrate these things. An additional element is the quality of information. So how do we do rhino monitoring and provide population estimates that are updated but also fairly precise? And a good example is one, don't count rhinos all in the same way. It's fairly easy to know about your 50 rhinos in one property, but when I start thinking about 2 to 3,000 rhinos sitting on a property that's the size of Israel, it's not such an easy way to count those rhinos. You certainly can't think up 3,000 different names for them. And then a key additional aspect is how we disrupt and overcome organized crime networks, and particularly when this require a range of different kind of investigative tools and techniques to be able to do that, and that requires some more resources that we currently have. I hope that's a quick summary for the team and the people down there. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. That was a very comprehensive overview of where we're at in Africa. So just stand by, Sam, and everybody. If Sam's presentation has raised any questions with you, just hold on to those for now. We'll come back to him in a moment. We're now going to jump over to India and Bibhab, who's going to talk to us about the situation with the Asian species. Over
Very
to you,
good evening.
Bibhab.
Yeah, very good evening. Can I go to the next slide? Yes. So I will start with the greater one-horn rhino, where the situation has improved vastly in the two range countries, the India and Nepal. And now population almost touch 4,075, an increase of about 60 rhinos from the last IUCN African Rhino Specialist Group, Asian Rhino Specialist Group, and traffic report submitted during the COP19 in Panama. So overall, the scenarios of greater one-horn rhino in both India and Nepal has been found stable, and the poaching pressure has been reduced because of good enforcement. From January 2021 till December 2024, in fact till today, now we are in the middle of September, there were only 9 rhinos killed in India, the greater one-horn rhino, and 4 in Nepal. Can you go to the next slide, please? So from the greater one-horn to the lesser one-horn, which is also known as the Javan rhino, the population increased till about 76, from about 35 to 40 during 2010. Unfortunately, there has been reported incidences of poaching of about 26 Javan rhinos during the period of 2019 to 2023, which has been in fact detected only in 2023 by investigations carried out by the Indonesian police. So that has shattered the growth of the Javan rhinos to a great extent, because we lost 26 rhinos out of 76, so almost 33% decline. And it is likely to have impact on the future growth of the Javan rhinos, because it definitely have shattered the male-female ratio. But the species is very elusive. We still are not sure how many male or how many females were killed by the poachers. But as per the investigations carried out by the Indonesian police, the figure stands at 26 Javan rhinos killed illegally during 2019 to 2023. Next, please. And the Sumatran rhino population is compared to what the report that we submitted earlier is almost stable. Of course, no renewed effort for estimation, a robust estimation of Sumatran rhinos took place. So from the Asian Rhino Specialist Group, we are still using the figure of 34 to 47, which is this population is mainly found in Indonesia. In northern Sumatra, of course, the population is comparatively better than in the southern Sumatra. There are challenges, even to find out the presence of Sumatran rhino in southern Sumatra. Of course, in recent times, some effort through eDNA has been initiated, but again, the confirmations of how many Sumatran rhinos we have in southern Sumatra is still lacking. However, in the northern Sumatra, based on the camera trap photos, the populations in that area is much better than in the southern area. Next, please. So, in about 316 greater one-horn rhinos were poached since 2006. Javan rhino, just as I mentioned, is 26. Killed just recently in between 2019 to 2023. And Sumatran rhino is a question mark, because we don't know, because not even the carcass of the natural death of Sumatran rhinos could be detected. So we are not sure whether any Sumatran rhinos were poached But the population decline definitely, suggests that decline may be because of isolated population and may also be because of poaching. But since no carcass has been detected of late in the Sumatran rhino habitat, so that's the reason why, we are putting a question mark here. So what is working? A proactive and consistent anti-poaching strategy, especially in India and Nepal, is working. And that is the reason why the poaching has declined and the overall population of greater one-horned rhino has increased. We could also see a strong government will to protect the rhinos and support the future population growth, especially in terms of the greater one-horned rhino in India and Nepal. Then dedicated support from people within the local communities and civil society has been acting as a pressure group that always prompts the government to take timely actions to secure the future of the rhino, especially the greater one-horned rhino in India and Nepal, which are doing much better compared to the other two critically endangered species of Asian rhinos, which are basically Sumatran rhino and Javan rhino. Now we are going to the next slide. The challenges, monitoring and population estimates is a major challenge, especially for the Sumatran and the Javan rhinos, as they live in the dense forest. It's difficult to estimate them. It's difficult to see them compared to the greater one-horned rhino, which are basically found in the open areas, in the grassland areas, which are easier to enumerate. The recent poaching of about 26 rhinos, which is about like 33% of the known population, is indeed, a major challenge that we need to face in order to rebuild the population of the critically endangered Javan rhino. Available, suitable, and secure habitat for connected landscape is a challenge. And then genetic limitations for small populations is a major challenge that at least the two of the Asian rhino species, the Sumatran and the Javan rhinos, are currently facing. Next, please.
Thanks very much indeed, Bipab. Again, very powerful, I think, to see those numbers in terms of the situation with the Asian species and particularly what's happening in Indonesia and the action that we can support there. I think lots of lessons learned for potentially to be learned for cross-pollination between Africa and Asia and between different species. So look forward to chatting through those points in a minute. Again, anyone who has any questions for Bipab, if you're watching online, do please drop those into the chat and we'll pick those up in a minute. But now we're going to hand over to Sharon, who's going to be talking to us about the trafficking of rhino horn.
Thank you, Joe. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about what happens when rhino horn goes into, or other products go into the illegal market and are then seized by authorities. And our currency of information here is seizure data. So we analyzed the seizure data for the report to CITES, and here are some of the findings that we found based on the last 10 years of time frame up till 2023. So in terms of what is seized, the commodities that we see mostly in the data relate to rhino horns, whether it's whole horns or pieces of horns. And some of it is because these are the commodities that are likely traded or illegally traded more, but some of it is probably likely a detection issue. So if we think, what are those commodities used for? They are used for traditional medicine, oftentimes in powder form, or some kind of composite of that, as well as, some libation cups or ornaments. And so oftentimes we may not detect those. But the data suggests that most of what we have is horn related. When we analyze it in terms of how much is seized and where, we see that, first of all, in terms of overall over time, we see that we had more that was seized in 2019, and this is going to be important in a second. And we roughly had, though, in the last 3 years, which were the period that we analyzed for the report, about 1.8 tons of horn products, or horn equivalent products, as we analyze them here, that were seized among parties. parties as in countries, CITES parties, as well as in terms of the seizures, these are based on roughly 900 seizures that informed the analysis. When we think of where these illegal horn products are seized, you could see that over time, we see certain parties or countries that are continually prominent in the data, such as South Africa, which is also a country where the majority of rhinos exist, species. And then we see others, such as Vietnam. And then over time, you see that some parties, for example, like China and Hong Kong SAR of China, that were more prominent in the data are not as prominent these days, as well as Mozambique. And then we find other emerging trends. For example, we talk about in the report that Mongolia was a new emerging linkage that we saw. So in terms of the trends overall, these are often, and we do a similar analysis with elephant ivory, illegal ivory trade. So perhaps it's a bit hard to see in this time series, but when you think about when did we have peaks? So 2019 is an interesting year, just before COVID, that we had a peak in terms of the quantity of illegal ivory that was seized, as well as rhino. As we'll see later on, these are oftentimes part of bigger seizures, multi-ton seizures at a time of many illicit commodities. So it could be pangolin scales, ivory, and other commodities. But it's not just where we see these items seized, but how are they moving? Can we get an understanding about the illegal network of what is happening with rhino horn trade? And so we presented the data, and actually with the help of SRI, we created an interactive tool that you guys can explore as well. It's available, and oops, we have a little bit of an echo here. And you can see how seizures are moving in terms of how the illegal trade is moving. So here you could see in the dark red is the most prominent link based on weight that was traded, illegally traded, in the last 3 years. So this represents the COP period of analysis, and that was between South Africa and Malaysia. But there are other prominent linkages between South Africa and Vietnam, and of course also North America, and some things go through Europe. So yeah. So in terms of what is working when we looked at the data and analysis, so certainly the information that we produce in the report, it does get adopted by the parties into targeted decisions. So the last COP, there were decisions that target most affected parties, as we say, countries. And then they are expected to come up with action plans and report back. In fact, some of the parties have national ivory and rhino action plans where they have to show some pillars of implementation on legislation, law enforcement. So these are good. The parties are taking note and are passing and adopting some actions to combat trafficking. And countries, as I mentioned, that previously ranked high or were prominent on the illegal trade, perhaps are not so in the last period. Again, there's a lot to consider here in terms of reporting and whether the data are represented over time, but also perhaps this is due to effective law enforcement and actually trying to combat the illegal trade. And lastly, there is a lot of collaboration that's happening. And in fact, in the last report, we talked about a control delivery, for example, where South African authority collaborated with Vietnam and actually, through investigation, allowed an illegal consignment that they knew was happening go through. And then authorities in Vietnam made the arrest, as well as arrested the other suspect. So really recognizing that this is a bigger network and working together to try and combat the illegal trade. What are challenges? So yeah, we do see the same parties oftentimes implicated over time. And again, some of it, it's just because of where we have more rhinos, as we talked about. They will be poached, there will be seizures on the ground close to where rhinos are. But oftentimes, we might want to think about how can we perhaps improve law enforcement outcomes, because making a seizure is not the end of it. Making an arrest is not the end of it. How do we effectively present evidence, continue prosecuting that link up to getting not just the the poacher on the ground, but the medium and high level operators of the syndicate. And so there was a recent example in Kenya when a person was previously arrested and convicted and served some prison on ivory trade, was released because of irregularities in how evidence was processed, and then now he's arrested again with rhino horn. So how can we work with parties, with countries to increase capacity on the ground, to improve the legislation process, to improve the law enforcement investigation process? Those are things that we can still think about. And as I mentioned, this is not just rhino horn. Oftentimes this is part of a greater crime syndicate, maybe other wildlife goods, as I've mentioned, pangolin scale ivory, maybe other illicit commodities. For example, this seizure by Qatar that was done earlier this year that also had narcotics. So thinking a little bit outside the box on how we can really learn from the different illicit goods and really target those criminal syndicates in trying to combating illegal trade in rhino species specimens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Very detailed analysis there and some really telling patterns, I think, in terms of what's happening with horn and what that means for rhinos and the different countries involved. So maybe before we open things up to the questions submitted in advance and any questions coming from the floor this evening, I could ask you to come and join me back up here, and we can have our speakers online. So, obviously you're all experts in your different specific species or geographies or areas of focus, but there were definitely some similarities coming through there, I think, in terms of what are the positives and opportunities for rhinos out there at the moment, and how can we leverage between those, as well as some shared challenges and difficulties. Sam, maybe I'll be mean and start with putting you on the spot in terms of what you see as positive opportunities, not just for African rhinos, but you're also seeing echoed elsewhere.
Thanks, Joe. When I was listening to what Bebop was saying, at the heart of all these good things is actually a person, and I think having those strengths in how you encourage, motivate, ensure integrity, and all those sort of things are really important elements. And I think that's a very common bit across there. The other bit is that's also important seem to be the successes that happens when you're collaborating across protected areas or protection of things. So those are things that, certainly in this report that we did now, it started emerging far more from what the various range states were reporting to us. Many of these examples, even the one that Sharon has highlighted there, of what we can achieve if we do work far better together. So in my mind, we need to think a little bit about how do we retain the motivation and the passion of our people that do things on the ground, but at the same time, how do we expand our collaboration and working together at a global scale across these various international scales that the whole rhino dynamics are busy happening.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think when people think of rhinos, they do think of them in those little fragmented in those wild places and those little fragmented populations. But as we've seen this evening, it's a global challenge and it's all connected. Bibhab, perhaps I could come to you.
Yeah, I think the commonality includes, for all the 5 species is the need for protection. The rhino has to be, protected because it has been a protected dependent species. So that's a commonality across Asia and Africa we have seen. And then, of course, we can see there are a lot of commonalities on the management of rhino and their habitat. Because based on the, the habitat management, we can definitely help rhinos to grow. And once rhino grows, the next step is basically to find out other alternative areas where rhino could be reintroduced based on their past distributions. So I think there are a lot of commonalities we can see from African context or from the Asian context. And that is where I think we feel that we all need to increase the partnership in order to help each other to secure the future of all the 5 species of rhinos.
Yeah, absolutely, Bibha. Thank you. We recognize that rhinos are really at the apex of 2 of the greatest threats to biodiversity, threatened not just by illegal wildlife trade, but also habitat loss or habitat fragmentation. And so by keeping rhinos safe in those landscapes, we're benefiting many other species and the ecosystems themselves. So absolutely, ways that we can learn between continents, between countries is really important. Sharon, coming from a slightly different angle, from the horns, not the rhinos, do you see any similarities?
Sure. Thank you, Joe. As my colleagues have mentioned, and you did, it's a holistic view of the issues that we have at hand, not only addressing the issues in terms of the population and strengthening them and all the good things that are done on the ground, and all the law enforcement, but really understand also the demand side and understanding holistically the network of the supply and demand. So I think there's a lot of collaborations that are done in that realm, and the more we do that, the better we have a holistic view of what's going on and how we can better combat that.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe just quickly before we open up to questions from online and on the floor, what about shared challenges? I picked up quite a few biological, environmental ones there, but there may be others. Anyone want to offer to go first with thoughts on that, or do I put you on the spot?
I think one of the things that perhaps we didn't talk about, well, one of the things is to increase capacity on the ground, whether it is in terms of the protection of population or the law enforcement investigation legislation in terms of enabling the court system to do the proper process so we see successful outcomes. One thing that I didn't talk a little bit is also in terms of the data and the quality of the data. We want to have a more, again, holistic picture of what's happening. So I think Sam talked a little bit about that in terms of the monitoring as well as BibHub. And that is true also for the seizure data and trying to understand where illegal trade is going and doing more sample and data sharing. So I think those are 2 common potential limitations.
Thanks, Sharon. Sam, I see hands in the room. Just bear with us a little bit longer. Sam, and any thoughts on?
No, thanks. Sharon highlighted those ones, but there's probably 2, there may also be, there's 2 critical ones in my mind. One was the monitoring, and Bibha has highlighted, and that's definitely a challenge that we share across places, I've explained. But we may also have interesting things that we learn in the places that are not necessarily between Asia and Africa. So, for example, the fragmented nature of our populations across our biological populations, and we certainly have got some challenges in how we deal with things like some genetic consequences, etc. And yes, even though there's been a lot of thinking a bit about how we can overcome this through using approaches like metapopulation frameworks, which connects the populations up, we definitely are struggling implementing that and getting our heads around how to implement it, particularly when we have got national aspirations that are often very strong and proudly strong, but the rhinos doesn't necessarily care in which country they are. So I think that's one bit. But I think, Joe, the other bit is we've talked a lot here about collaboration between governments, but our opportunities is extremely high if we start thinking about the collaborations with the local people around us, and as some of those aspects are shown to us. And then from the biological management point of view, Joe, the one other aspect that's important is, we've phrased that there are challenges with loss of habitat, but in reality, there's actually quite a large bit of habitat left and available for rhinos. Our difficulty is it's not safe habitat. So that's the shortage. So how do we innovatively address these and get safe habitats? And this is where working with some of our local people with us can actually open up opportunities which doesn't necessarily require the intensive protection requirements that we currently have. And certainly we have not explored those options as broadly as what we can. There are good, beautiful examples, for example, in Northwest Namibia as an example, but that's certainly a scope for us to expand into.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. As ever, excellent points. I was, as you were making your last point there, I was remembering our event last year with Simpson Urikob, CEO of Save the Rhino Trust in Namibia, who was sharing their work, which I think is a great example of that. And I agree with you, many more opportunities to explore there. Bipab, lastly, to you, any shared challenges?
Yeah, I would like to highlight, of course, poaching. Everybody knows rhino it's been a species and poaching pressure is on. But at least for the Asian species, what we found the threat is also coming because of the spread of alien invasive plant species, and that has really posing a major threat, at least for the greater one-horned rhino in both India and Nepal. So I think, a lot of emphasis research has to be, encouraged in order to control, the spread of invasive alien plant species to accommodate the increasing number of greater one-horned rhinos in India and Nepal. So there is an opportunity also on that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Thanks, Bibhab. And I believe it's the Renga palm that is also a challenge as an invasive species in Ujung Kulon National Park in Java, which is home to the single last population of Javan rhinos. So yeah, we often don't think about other plant species in particular as being a threat, but there are those complexities. And of course, they will also, the growth and spread of those plant species will also be impacted by climate change. So as ever with rhinos, it's a complicated web of interrelated challenges to tease out. Thank you all. Lots for us to reflect on and take forward. Perhaps I'll shift now to some of the questions that were submitted in advance online. The first one comes from Thora Talling in the UK. And this one is perhaps particularly pertinent because we're talking about CITES and the upcoming COP this evening. Thora asks whether legislation is the most important thing now to tackle poaching. Sharon, do you want to kick us off with legislation?
Sure. I think in many cases, and perhaps Bibab and Sam can add as well, because they're more familiar in their regions, but in many cases, as well as in CITES, we have the legislation and we have the decisions as how do we effectively implement them. And whether it is effectively allocating resources, whether then effectively holding certain partners or stakeholders accountable, enabling. So I think that could be one area. So perhaps we don't need as much more legislation, although there's some areas that could probably strengthen their wildlife law. And actually in the Rhino Task Force meeting that we just had is also recognizing that wildlife crimes are serious crimes. So that was one of the discussions of the task force and some of the outcomes. So perhaps that in terms of legislation, but also effectively implementing it.
Thanks, Sharon. So you think largely the laws are in place, it's that people just don't have the money or the skills or the equipment to really enact them?
It depends. Obviously, every situation would be unique, but it's all of the above, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent point about taking this beyond just wildlife law and recognizing it as a form of serious organized crime and making sure that kind of legislation is implemented. Sam, Bibhab, thoughts on, is legislation really what we need right now?
So Joe, I agree with Sharon that legislation is probably in place. In fact, there's been a few countries that's even improved their legislation in the last 3 years. one of the challenges, when we're talking about a bit about international spaces, something like CITES, they don't actually carry a mandate in terms of an enforcement mandate. It happens through the country's various how they build in those CITES resolutions and things into the local laws. But I think one of the challenges legislatively wise is, no country has got a say over another country. So if you're talking about this like metapopulation management across borders and stuff like that, there may be some interesting legislative challenges, for example, how we do that. So that's perhaps an area where certainly some smart legal people can go and think a little bit about how do we facilitate a process where the national aspiration doesn't necessarily override the international requirements, if I can put it that way, to help us address these particular. I'm thinking particularly about biological management of rhinos.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Good point from the biological management point, but also from a law enforcement perspective, we're emphasizing that this is serious organized crime, but it's also transnational crime. So simply having if the laws in one country don't govern what happens to the horn once it's left, that is something that would need to be looked at. Bibhab, any thoughts?
Well, I think legislation is definitely needed, but we don't need many legislations. I think implementation is also important. But what is important, I feel, is to work with communities, garner support from the communities so that the prevention, can be ensured, in case of either the rhino poaching or subsequent illegal wildlife trade.
Thanks, Bibhab. I think, Tim, you have a question in the room. Just pass you the mic.
Thank you. I'm Tim Holmes. I'm a patron of Save the Rhino, and firstly, just a big thank you to all the Save the Rhino team as a fundraiser. I think all these stats are incredibly helpful, and big shout out and thank you for all the team for presenting them so clearly. I've got a question about the one-horn rhino, which is a bit unusual for me, so I'm usually involved with fundraising for African rhino, and I'm really good to see you today. I last visited Chitwan in 2000, and I'm in fact going at Christmas, and it's pleased to hear that it's working, Bibhab. You talk about habitat management, you've talked about collaboration. What's the success, do you think, that you've had now in those numbers increasing? It's obviously a lot of things, but what should I expect to see?
Thank you for your questions. I think the number increased mainly because of the poaching decrease, and both the government in India and Nepal, I think what we have seen noticeably is this strong commitment of the government and strong political will that has enhanced the protection measures, because protection measures has to be dynamic. Threats are still there, attempts were also being made, but because of good networking, the prevention could reduce the number of rhinos being poached, and that has resulted into increase of rhino population in both India and Nepal. So I think that's what I feel, it's a great leadership from the government, because in the Asian context, all the rhinos are basically government property. We don't have private ranches like in Africa. So government has to lead, and I think from the greater one-horn rhino, there may be a lot of lesson learned for the other Asian countries as well, to enhance, and the possibilities that even though the rhino population may have declined because of poaching, but I think there are ways to increase it through stringent protection and strong will of the government and also the people.
Thanks, Bibhab. I think that's an excellent point. And you've reminded me, actually, it was one of my reflections on shared success factors. Certainly when we look at the countries in Africa that still have healthy black rhino populations, it's those that during the first poaching wave in the 70s and 80s really had the political will and the governance and the commitment to conservation to invest long-term at that stage in retaining and recovering those populations. I mean, Sam, would you agree with that for Africa and black rhinos? And would you say the same's true for white?
Yeah, Joe, I think obviously the creation of protection and innovative and cost-efficient protection is a really important aspect. No matter what we talk about safe habitat or anything like that, the critical driver is still if there's too many killed, you're not going to have a population growing. But there are some very important other insights, Joe. There was a recent, as you're aware, you were part of that publication, the recent work where we effectively evaluated the effectiveness of a range of interventions. And I think what the key lesson was there is historically we would tend to do things in our protection activities which is really aimed at demotivating or affecting a criminal to try and poach rhinos in the first place. So that's our detection abilities, and when it turns in there, how we use dogs and things to chase them. But when we added an additional one, well, that is reduce the reward that can happen, and that was by dehorning rhinos. That study showed very clearly that dehorning had a significant impact on the poaching rates. But the dehorning alone can't do that. You actually have to have all the other packages as well. And that was an innovative analysis and an intuitive response that the rangers on the ground wanted to do. And I think we probably need to think a little bit more about, can we think out of the box and get out of our comfort zones and go and do similar kind of things and try it and check how it happens. But that was a very important insight that happened from that particular work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sam. We did a webinar on that study by Dr. Tim Caper that had been published in Science. That's on our YouTube channel website. I think we did that back in July. You'll find that on the website from July if people are interested in learning more about that one. And that leads me nicely into a question that's come in from Astrid Haig-Smith. Astrid's asking, what is proving the best way to save rhinos from poachers? Do we have enough rangers or do we need better technology? Sam, just reflect, without wanting to make you repeat yourself, what have we learned recently that informs that kind of question?
No, I think that analysis Tim has highlighted that we do need to have a multi-pronged approach. The technology is just an aspect that helps you to improve your probability of achieving something, like improving my probability of knowing somebody is there or improving my probability of detecting a gunshot. But I still have to have the wet gear, the people that actually do things and follow up, etc. What I think is really important, and this has not been out in the analysis yet, is that it does seem to us that you can have enough rangers to do anti-poaching, etc. But certainly when we get to very big areas, you require some people that are just spending time watching rhinos and not to protect rhinos, to actually learn and see what the rhino is doing. I always make this point, and particularly in large areas, it's quite difficult doing this when you've got a large number of rhinos. But we tend to have the ability to tell more about how many dead rhinos we've got than actually how many calves we've got, for example, in a place. And switching that dynamics and adding it to the existing suite of things that we have got may give us another edge again, like what we achieved when we started doing the dehorning. Of course, Joe, if we are still dehorning rhinos in 5 years from now, we have been unsuccessful in addressing the actual original cause, the underlying causes of what's happening. So I think we must be careful that we don't get just stuck on the reacting to what the current situation is, but thinking out of the box, like the kind of things that Bebop and them has highlighted. How do you cooperate broader than the traditional cooperation, cooperate with everybody around us that can help us achieve a better outcome?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely, Sam. We're seeing dehorning might be a helpful short-term response. It might give people a bit of breathing space, but no one's promoting it as a long-term solution, I don't think, and that needs that bigger picture thinking. Bibhab, any thoughts for Astrid on the question of Do we need more rangers, or do we need more technology, or do we need something else altogether?
I think a combination of both is essential, but feet on the ground is very crucial, even if we are using the technologies. So I think a culmination of both balanced technology and tools, and then the feet on the ground can ensure to secure the future of rhinos.
Yeah, thanks, Bipab. I think this point that technology can be, this isn't my favorite phrase, but the idea of technology as a force multiplier, or something that at least helps people work more effectively, can be valid. But it's not always just about the number of people you have working for you. It's their morale, it's their mindset, it's the extent to which they're valued and see that they're really making a difference, and they have autonomy within their roles. And so, a lot of the work that Save the Rhino is doing with rangers around the world is about really investing in them as such a crucial part of conservation that's so often not valued really and appreciated as it should be. We're coming towards the end of our evening. We have a question from Raj in the room. Do you need to shout, Raj? Or I'll pass you this. No, here we go.
Thanks. I'm so sorry. So maybe a question for Sharon, but open to everyone. Sharon, you mentioned that the trends in the CITES parties or countries is shifted a little bit or changed. I was just curious, have the types of products and commodities that you see coming up, have those shifted as well as the audiences have?
Thank you for the question. It's always the $1 million question. A lot of times what we see is correlative. We can't always infer causation. There have been certain bans or increases in penalties and certain wildlife laws. So for example, Vietnam has passed stronger penalties for some of the wildlife laws. China had, and I'm talking about consumer countries right now, has had a ban on ivory, but potentially also increased enforcement, law enforcement all around. We can also think about, when we're analyzing trends of the last few years. So potentially we do see a reduction. And you ask about the nature of the commodities, we still see some commodities that are used, for example, in traditional medicine. But again, I think a lot of it, potentially, we don't have the full picture because it's easier to detect a horn or horn piece. It's harder to detect, there's products like glue, wildlife product glue or powder or rhino horn powder. So we have to take things with a grain of salt of the resolution of the data that we have. But also another thing to think about is COVID-19. And again, when I think about this in terms of the illegal ivory trade, we did see a reduction overall in terms of the seizures and potentially use and potentially also the disruption of certain networks. So potentially those have not recovered yet. So some of what you're asking also relates to the demand and understanding demand. And I think this is something that has been underlying throughout our conversation. The last questions about, do we need more rangers? What do we need in terms of technology? Some of it is understanding demand and the social factor, whether is what motivates a poacher on the ground to go and poach, and what motivates, what commodities consumers are after and motivates them to purchase or consume rhino horn products. And so we still need to learn more. There's some studies that Traffic is doing as well, and other entities, and some of it is in the report, but I think we still need to know better and understand better. This problem is very dynamic, and it can change like that because of some kind of social event. So yeah, perhaps I'm not giving all the answers. I don't always have all of them, but I think we can do more potentially to understand the social and the behavioral aspects of the issues.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Sharon. I think that brings us to our hour this evening. I'm sure we could keep talking for a lot longer on a lot of these thorny issues, but we need to let our speakers go, especially Bibhab, for whom it's getting late over there now. So let me just wrap up by firstly saying a huge thank you to all of our speakers for their really vitally important work and sharing their knowledge with us this evening. To everybody who's joined us online, thank you so much for tuning in and for all the great questions you submitted in advance, which helped us shape and refine this evening. Thanks to those of you who've joined us in person. It's always such a pleasure to see you all, and we're so grateful for your interest and support. We'll be continuing our webinars throughout the rest of this year, and I think in particular look forward to feeding back to you after the CITES COP on where all of this information lands and what the next steps will be. So thanks very much to all of you. Thanks to the team who make these events happen, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Good night.